Hey everyone, my name is Ishan. I'm the president of the American Immigrant Investor Alliance. We are a 501c4 nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C. We advocate for EB5 investors who invest in the program. So with that said, let's get into it. I've got a couple of panelists here with me who are pretty great. So I'm going to start by introducing them. So firstly, I have with me Suzanne Lazicki. She is an incredible business plan writer. So if you're an EB5 investor who's maybe perhaps looking to start their own project, Suzanne is the woman for you. Same thing if you're a developer or investment issuer, you really should be using her to write up your business plan. Then next with me is Joey Barnett. Joey is an immigration lawyer and also the person who filed my EB5 petition and got me my green card. Alongside him is colleague Charlie Oppenheim, former chief of visa control. I suppose he would be the guy that really allowed for my visa to be issued to me unknowingly. Then I have Halston Chavez of the Galati law firm. The Galati law firm represented me and hundreds of other EB5 investors in getting their petitions approved quickly. And they've also filed and continue to file a number of EB5 petitions. So that's everyone. So we're going to discuss a little bit of the context. Why are we here? Why is this data that we're presenting to everyone so incredibly important? We'll go over the visa supply so everyone really understands, where the visa numbers come from. We'll go over the actual data that we've gotten, which is the demand, and then we'll kind of go over our projections and analysis of this data. We'll also add a little bit about what we see the future of, the visa program turning out and how visas would be issued going forward. If you are a pre-RIA investor, meaning if you are an investor that has invested before March 2022, I would recommend you go to our YouTube channel and watch our webinar. We did another FOIA request asking for the number of pending petitions at USCIS, and we did a great analysis with Suzanne and Dennis Tristani, which kind of covers this topic. So again, if you are an investor who invested before March 2022 and you're trying to figure out what the wait time, etc., looks like, I recommend going to our YouTube channel and watching that. Now, with that said, let's give it a little bit of context.
So this data is so important. I think the best way to describe it is because, and it's a great analogy that some of us put together, is that there are an unlimited number of EB5 petitions that can be filed, or if you want to do an analogy, an unlimited number of plane tickets that can be sold, but there's a limited number of visas that can actually be issued each year. And so in that case, there's a limited number of seats on the airplane. So while there's an unlimited number of tickets being sold, not everybody can get on the airplane. And so the big question is, well, how many people are in line? And it's important to know how many people are in line to know how long it could take for you to get on that airplane, like how many airplanes have to take off before you can get on. And so that's really the main thing that we're trying to get at with this webinar.
So to simplify that even further, if you are an EB5 investor and you file your I-526E, it will take a certain amount of time to be adjudicated. That's great. Once it's adjudicated and approved, at that point of time, you now have to file for adjustment of status, or if you're in the country, you would have already filed for it, or if you're outside, you'll go through the consulate. But in order to move forward to the next stage and actually get the conditional green card in your hand, there needs to be a visa number available. Now, the thing is, if there aren't any visa numbers available to be issued to you, you get caught in a backlog. Now, that's really bad because now you have to wait even longer to actually receive your conditional green card. The thing is, USCIS doesn't, as of this point of time, openly publish the number of applicants, the number of petitions that are in line in front of you. So you don't actually know how many visa numbers are going to be taken up. So when you actually move forward to that stage, and if the visa bulletin suddenly now shows a priority date that is before the date that you invested, you're going to face a delay in actually receiving the main benefit, the main reason why you did EB5 in the first place, which is the green card. So AIIA, we filed a Freedom of Information Act request in May. USCIS did not respond in a timely fashion. We employed the help of the Galati law firm. Halston actually sat and wrote the complaint that the initial draft of the complaint, which has now been filed in court and which actually allowed us to get this data. We've spent some time analyzing it now, so we hope to kind of go over that going forward. So first things first, let's add a little bit of more context and show and explain to people what exactly does the supply of visas look like. So I'm going to hand that over to Joey, Suzanne, and Charlie. Let's explain this image. I know it's kind of complicated. It looks really heavy, but let's talk about it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ishan, for having us on to speak about this very important topic and for spearheading the FOIA to get this data. It's excellent that AIIA has been doing this. And this slide here shows the annual numerical limits for fiscal year 2024. As Halston mentioned, every year there are a limited number of visas that are available in the employment-based context. The minimum is always 140,000, but that can be increased by the unused family-based visas from the previous fiscal year. And the Department of State recently indicated that there were 21,000 unused family-based visas from fiscal year 2023. So those got added in, and the total annual limit is 161,000. And within that 161,000, that's for employment-based EB1 through 5. We break it down in the numbers here, but EB5 gets 7.1% of those new allocations that come out every year. And with the new the new provisions in the INA, the unreserved, they get 68% of those, and the reserved or set-aside categories get 32% of those. And then there are different reserved categories, the rural, high unemployment, and infrastructure, and they all get a subset of that annual limit. So this here is just a quick graphic of the limits, of the numbers that came into existence as of October 1st, 2023, with the beginning of the new fiscal year.
This is the base allocation, and then there's the additional factor of carryover visas, which we'll go on to talk about in the next slide.
The important thing to sort of look at based upon this image is that this is just the 2024 estimation, or 2024 numbers. The base case of visa issuance would not typically look like this. So this number that you're seeing, 161,000, would be 140,000. Correct me if I'm wrong. So
that's correct. Yeah, that's the minimum that is set in the INA, and the INA also allows those unused numbers. And let's just go to the next slide. You'll see that this overall number has gone down over the past 3 years, and that's that first column there, the worldwide numerical limit. And I guess, Charlie, do you mind just mentioning why
Sure.
we had such a high limit back in fiscal year 2021 and what you anticipate to happen maybe in fiscal year 2025 as well?
Sure. As you mentioned, the employment-based limit is 140,000 plus any unused family numbers. During the COVID pandemic years, the State Department was not able to utilize the vast majority of the family-based numbers. And the State Department uses approximately 95% of the family-sponsored numbers. And because of post-closures, there was excessive amounts of unused numbers, resulting in extremely high annual limits for employment for fiscal 21 through the current fiscal 2024. I would expect that family-sponsored number use will approach the annual limit of 226,000 in fiscal 2024 and beyond. And therefore, this 161 we see for 2024 is most likely in the future going to be in the 140 to 150,000 range.
Thank you. And the RIA, the new EB5 law, also created these carryover provisions, which allow unused reserved visas to be carried over into the next fiscal year. And that's what we see with these green slides. This is our attempt at a visualization of a waterfall showing the unused visas going down each year. And what we have here in fiscal year 2024 are those 6,396 from fiscal year 2022 that weren't used in the past 2 years. And so right now, those have been allocated towards the unreserved visa category. Charlie, what happened? And let me first ask, what would happen if those 6,396 visa numbers aren't used in fiscal year 2024?
Then they would be able to fall over for 2025 use, distributed. And this is a very unique thing that these carryover numbers, it only happens in the 3 reserved categories. So this is an extremely good benefit that applicants are receiving if they're filing under one of these 3 reserved categories.
Well, my thought was if those unreserved carryover visas, that 6,396, if they're not used in this fiscal year.
Oh, yes. If the 6,396, I apologize. If they're not going to be used, if those numbers which were carried over from the last fiscal year, they can only be carried over one time. So if those numbers are not required for the reserve this year, they can be made available to unreserved, increasing the unreserved limit for fiscal 2024. And if they're still not used, then they can fall up to the employment first preference and be made available then, if they're not required for the unreserved applicants.
I guess 2 things on this. One, the Department of State indicated to the American Immigration Lawyer Association that they're going to first use the carryover numbers before using the, I would say, new allocation of visa numbers, which is good to prevent visa wastage. And then the other thing I would say is the Department of State actually did a pretty good job in fiscal year 2023 to use the unreserved visa numbers. We don't have the full, this is the last column, the middle row. We have a question mark there because we don't know how many adjustment of status applications have been approved. And, you know, really what I wanted to kind of point out here with the supply, and it gets to the demand, is we need these visa numbers to be used in this fiscal year as much as possible, because you see as the worldwide numerical limit decreases, so does the total number of visas that end up being available for EB-5. And then the other thing that I wanted to say was that, and this relates to Ishan's point, you know, it's not enough just to get an I-526 approval. We need to get that case to a stage where a visa can be used. So because of this sort of inertia and the processing times, it is possible that the 4,478 reserve visas from this that are carried over into this year may not all be used again.
Would you say it's not only possible, but also certain that they won't be used?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not all of them. And what we've been discussing, maybe Charlie, you can even mention, like, at what point of the year would you want these cases to be adjudicated by IPO in order for potential use by the end of September?
I think that any case that is approved after March is unlikely to have any chance of being processed this fiscal year. And so they need to be processed and the petitions approved as quickly as possible this fiscal year in order to maximize number use. And unfortunately, as you said, I doubt there is going to be much use of these numbers, if any, this fiscal year.
And just to add a small piece of clarity, we have seen I-526E petitions approved. We just haven't seen the concurrent adjustments approved yet. So
Correct.
That's why there's a lot of variables, because if we haven't seen it under post-RIA yet, we can't estimate how long that's going to take, or on average, how long USCIS is taking after an I-526E approval.
So this slide here is just a screenshot from what the Department of State published earlier this month the annual numerical limits. That's where we got the 161K that you saw on the earlier slides. And it breaks it down. That's where we get the 7773 and the 3658 for the reserved. And then they have these per country caps. And this is what I wanted to talk about, sort of to introduce the issue of per country caps, because there appears to have been a change of interpretation, or at least an application of the law by the Department of State. And I think that impacts countries where there is high EB-5 demand, but not necessarily overall demand for all employment and family-based preference visas. And so the one thing before I get into that is I want to make sure that everyone understands that these numbers here do not include any of the carryover visas from prior fiscal years. We have some charts that Suzanne has put together that we're going to be talking about next. But what I wanted to mention here was in March of 2023, the Department of State changed how they interpreted which countries are subject to per country caps, at least as it relates for the EB-4 preference category. And pretty much what they said is that the per country limit is only implemented when the full immigrant visa demand from a country exceeds 7% of the total number of preference visas made available in a fiscal year. So let me break that down into English. There's 161,000 employment-based numbers. There is 226,000 family-based. And when you add those together, that's 387,000. 7% of that it's right around 27,000. And so if there isn't demand for one country for 27,000 family-based and employment-based visas, the way that I'm at least reading what Department of State is saying is, even if there is crazy demand for rural from, let's just say, the example that we were throwing around as discussing is like, if there were 1,000 Croatians that filed I-526Es, they may still not be subject to a per country cap for a reserve category, because overall there isn't demand for those 27,000 visas by Croatians in general. And that's something that we're learning more about. And I think we're going to have to really see from the Department of State's annual report the numbers on EB-4 usage to really get an understanding of how they are going to be using that. But because of that change, that impacts which countries are going to be subject to a per country cap. Suzanne or Charlie, did I make sense on that?
Yeah, historically, the only countries that ever approach or use their per country limit for the combined family and employment categories are China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines. All other countries are typically well below their overall per country limit. And as you say, then no per country cap would be applied to them.
That per country cap, is it based on the 32% that go to reserved, or is it more specific than that? Is it based on rural, high unemployment, and infrastructure?
I believe that they would do it broken down by each category, the rural, the high unemployment, and the infrastructure.
The per country cap in general, what was Congress's intent behind that?
The intent, congressional intent, was of applying a 7% per country cap was to prevent a handful of countries from monopolizing all the numbers. For example, in the family categories, Mexico and Philippines could use virtually all of the family-sponsored numbers. And in the employment categories, if there was no per country limit, the Indian and Chinese applicants could use the vast majority of at least the employment first, second, and third preference categories.
Does a per country cap mean that Chinese and Indian nationals will only get 7% this number that we see here on the screen plus the carryover? Is that the maximum that they can get?
Luckily, Congress saw fit on the employment categories to say if there were otherwise unused numbers under the per country limit, say any of these 3 reserved categories, then those unused numbers could be made available to any country in per country limit or without regard to per country limit. And the visa numbers would be made available strictly in priority date order. So the short answer is no. China and India are not subject to strictly the per 7%. They could, and in previous years have received far more numbers than that.
And that's how it's always been. That's how, why Chinese have gotten, historically over 80% of EB5 visa numbers, even though they are subject to a per country cap as well.
Correct. And it allows the maximum amount of numbers to be used. It would be silly to limit China and India number use if the rest of the world limit was not going to be reached. So they give like I said, they give any of the otherwise numbers to any country that has already reached their normal per country limit.
This slide here, Suzanne was really good at sort of putting our discussion into a digestible format here, which I think governs how Department of State may look at whether a country cap would be imposed. And what I think is a little bit different is this second yellow rectangle. Previously, that wasn't there. And the limit of, the per country cap was to prevent monopolization of visa use. And I think what they're saying with this new interpretation is that it's okay if they monopolize, if one country monopolizes a specific visa category, as long as they don't monopolize overall the preference categories. At least that's how I interpret it. Suzanne, do you have any points you wanted to make on the per country supply side issue?
Yeah, one reason why I broke it down this way is that I think it is important that the first question to think about is demand for this category maxed out? Because if it isn't, there's no reason for them to prorate per country. They just give the visas out in FIFO order, regardless of what country you're from, because they don't have to do traffic control if there isn't more applicants than there are visas available. And so long as the total demand for rural, let's say, or high unemployment visas is less than the supply, then applicants from China and India don't need to sweat. It's just based on their priority date. It's not based on their nationality. And so what applicants from China and India should be looking at is at what point does demand for my category start to exceed supply? And at that point, it becomes important what country you're from. And so in that case, China and India would be looking at an equation that how many visas I can expect to get or how many visas I can expect to be available to me are up to the 7% country cap to my country, plus whatever's left over from the rest of the world. And so that's why on the slides coming up, we have demand broken down by China, India, and rest of the world, because it's really that rest of the world number that's going to create how many visas are available to you. You're not limited to 7%. Your equation is 7% plus the share of what's left over from rest of the world. On the next slide, this is like Joey's slide, except that I added in kind of a projection into 2025 and 2026. I did it first for rural, then for high unemployment. And I want to point out the factors in projection. Number one is column B, estimating what's going to be the total employment-based allocation. So in my projection here, I just put in the base 140,000, assuming things are going to be back to the post-COVID normal by next year as far as the total visas available. So it could be higher if we have another factor that results in EB5 getting more visas than usual, as in the past. And then the next assumption area is in column E, when we're guessing how many visas are going to carry over. What happened in 2024, that's a fact. So thinking about, is there going to be carryover into 2025? There will be if the number in column D for 24 was not used. And I think we can be almost certain that that number in column D in 24 is not going to be used, because Department of State confirmed whatever visas they give out this year, they're going to start giving out carryover for. So long as they don't give out more than 2,700 rural visas, which I'm sure isn't possible, we're going to see the base number from 24 carry over into 25. And I left 2026 blank because I don't know what's going to happen then, but it's also possible if in 25 they don't give out that many visas, we could see carryover into 26 as well. And then I added column G and column H there, calculating 7% of the total and 86% of the total. 7% of the total, just because that's the number that if you're from China or India, you know, at least this many visas are available to my country. But also I calculated that 86% there, because if China and India are at limit, this is the most that the rest of the world could get. And to the extent that rest of the world demand is much less than the numbers in column 8, then those numbers in column 8 are going to be available above the 7% limit to China, India.
When in the fiscal year would Department of State be able to make that projection of, hey, the rest of the world isn't going to be used, and so we can then allocate towards countries that are, you know, at the cap or subject to the cap?
Well, as long as in this regard, and as long as the worldwide demand and number use is less than the annual limit, everything stays current. Again, meaning numbers are immediately available. They would only impose a final action date if and when the demand and number use is going to exceed the annual limit. And that is very unlikely to happen for the foreseeable future. Definitely not in fiscal 2024.
And if we want to do the next slide, it just replicates this one, except this one's rural. The next slide is breaking down the high unemployment visa availability. So I put the same assumptions into column B, and the difference here is that D is calculated as 10% of that total versus 20%. And I guess the thing I want to add here is that looking at column G and column H, if you're selling high unemployment or rural, you could also think about this is sort of the sustainable market size. These are the number of visa applicants that we can afford to get in before we start looking at backlogs. When we get into the high unemployment 10%, that starts looking a little smaller.
Okay, so let's get to the meat of the issue, which is the demand. We've been able to get this data through a Freedom of Information Act request. Like I said earlier, we only have the data from April of last year till April of this year. That's because we filed a FOIA request in May and sued soon after that. The goal of us highlighting the rest of this data is to just show you information based on what we have. At some point, we'll also get into projections, but we first want to just focus on the data that we know for a fact is true. So here's essentially a summary of everything that we've gathered thus far. Suzanne, do you want to explain this a little bit?
Sure. So this is the summary of the FOIA data. And just to be clear, it is a summary. What AIIA got was filings by month throughout this period. And USCIS also broke it down by a few more countries. They put in Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan. What we highlighted on this chart are the total I-526, I-526E that were filed from the beginning of April 2022 to the end of April 2023. And we broke it down by China, India, rest of world, just because those are the categories that are key for demand. And another thing that's important to think about is what this represents. What this represents is USCIS going into I-526 and I-526E filings and seeing what the petitioners, which boxes they checked as far as is this rural high unemployment or whatever. Petitioners are allowed to check more than one box if they want to, and what the petitioners put in as far as their country of chargeability. And then they put together this report. So there is some scope for human error here, For example, the numbers on this report are 170 different from USCIS's official report. So somebody counted the paper files a little bit wrong, and we're not exactly sure what's going on with the petitioners who apparently checked both rural and high unemployment. I was also a little surprised by the large number who are checked as unreserved. I wouldn't have expected that many people to apply in the unreserved category. Also, there's no column for infrastructure here because USCIS did not record any I-526 filings received for the infrastructure category.
And we're going to get into this a little bit more with the assumptions, but it's really important to realize that this is the number of petitions received. So this is not taking into account dependents. And so this is not, like, you would want to multiply this by an average number of dependents per petition to understand the number of visas that would be issued if all of these were approved.
Now, this information is also important for both stakeholders, which is both investors as well as EB-5 professionals. For investors, this is important because you need to know, especially if you're from a potentially backlogged country, if there is, going to be a backlog in the set-aside category that you're looking to invest into. And for EB-5 industry folks, I mean, this information is just important for your planning needs to decide whether or not that, you want to do an offering with a specific set-aside category. And keep in mind, the information we release here today may cause the market to swing in one direction, but it's like a seesaw. If there's too many folks in one category, then that may become backlogged, then too many in the other. So it's hard to predict how that will turn out. But the one theme that I would like to highlight is how important this information actually is.
Interesting here was showing that China isn't dominating the market like it has historically, that there are a lot of other markets that are here. And I think the other thing, and this gets to, I guess, more of an issue of supply, is that, unlike before with the unreserved visa category, where you had a lot of Chinese investors from 2010 to 2015, 16 with those earlier priority dates, right now, people are filing all the time from whatever country. And it's not like those otherwise unused visas are only going to go towards Chinese investors. And that's one of the big differences that is playing out with these reserve visas as opposed to the unreserved ones.
No, I think you're exactly right. In the pre-RIA, China was out of the box several years earlier than the rest of the world, which really did not start filing in high numbers until 2017. Under the new RIA, everybody got out of the gate pretty much on equal footing. So we're seeing,
and that'll be illustrated in the next couple of charts too, that where we plotted the monthly information that AIIA got.
So when comparing sort of the number of petitions that are being filed broken down by the set-aside category, clearly, high unemployment dominates the space. We do see a lot more of those filings. For example, if you take a look around December, January, there was a huge spike in the petitions being filed. But again, most of them were for the high unemployment category projects. The other spikes that, of course, when the first set of 956Fs were filed, and as the folks came in, we saw a huge spike in September 2022. And from there on out, obviously there's a steady increase of petitions coming in for both rural and high unemployment. But the big one takeaway again that I'll repeat is that there are significantly higher number of high unemployment petitions coming in compared to rural.
Yeah, and I would also say that once things got going around September 2022, there's not that strong of a trend. We can't say that, high unemployment is going up like that, or it almost looks like maybe 3 big projects came to market or something like that. Yeah, and the next slides just show it broken down by country, and you can see what Joey and Charlie were talking about, that India and China and rest of the world, they've been filing neck to neck. So the priority dates will be more in line at the visa stage versus the unreserved situation where almost all the China priority dates are older than India.
And just to clarify Suzanne's point, it's not like we're seeing from the data from April to April a steady increase in the number of filings as it goes, as you get through the month. It seems like it's relatively steady in the number of filings that go in, at least through the data that we've gotten in the FOIA.
Yeah.
And another thing that I noticed on here is that a majority of the filings that are in the inventory that we know about now are from the 8 months leading up to April 2023. And we're now almost 8 months beyond April 2023. So that's another sort of convenient thing to think about, as sort of try to visualize what might have happened since the time as of which we have data. So this is the slide for rural, and the next slide shows high unemployment by country.
So like Suzanne just mentioned, we don't know what the data between April and now looks like. Of course, it is the organization's goal to eventually get that data as well. But yeah, one can speculate and wonder what that looks like.
Yeah, the only other things, and people can do their own calculations, I just thought this was interesting, was that for rest of world, so not including China or India, about 75% were high unemployment based petitions. And that is consistent with Chinese nationals as well. And it seems like there were more Indian nationals going into rural projects than Chinese or rest of world, percentage-wise.
Okay, so let's get into the assumptions based on the projections we have. So there's a couple of things that have already been mentioned, a couple of the variables, such as we don't know how many dependents per I-526 there could be. You could have a petition like mine where you had one single investor, or you can have a petition like one of the investors I just recently worked with, who he himself plus his wife and 2 kids. So 4 visas in total would be demanded on his petition. So you can have a variety of them, and we don't know exactly what each, how many dependents each petition will hold. We also don't know how long it will take for someone who files their I-526E and gets their approval, how long it will take them to actually get their conditional green card in hand. And along with that, we also don't know how long the petitions will take to be approved on average. Do you want to talk a little bit about the 4 Ds as well, Joey?
Sure, yeah, this is a patented Bernie Wolfstorff 4D, which impacts the demand based on I-526 filing numbers. And, there could be denials, there could be people who file withdrawals, there could be petitioners or derivatives who die, there could be divorces. All of those impact the actual demand for visa numbers. And it's not like we can just take the I-526E filing numbers and multiply it by average dependents on face value, because there are some of these other items that impact the overall demand.
So this is kind of an important slide. So starting from the left, this is what we estimate the pipeline demand for rural visas to be at this point of time. So you multiply the number of petitions by 2, or in the next bar's case by 3, and that's what we estimate the actual demand being based on the data that we have. So again, there could be more petitions between now and then, but based on the data we have, this is what we estimate the possible demand being. The actual supply, yellow bar is 4, and I guess in a normal year, which would be without the carryovers and everything else, the base case scenario would be the bar on the right, the red one.
And Sean or Suzanne, can you explain how you chose 2 and 3?
Sure. For me personally, when I'm trying to ballpark visa demand from a number of filed I-526, I tend to use the number 2, and that is assuming that a historical average of 36% of principal applicants in visas issued. And then I also add the assumptions that 30% of people there are 30% attrition, I guess, between I-526 filing and the visa stage due to denials and whatever. So putting those 2 numbers together, it comes up with 2 as a multiplier to get from I-526 2 visas demanded, or if you want to be a little bit more pessimistic about how many people are going to survive to the visa stage, how big their families are going to be. 3 is multiplying by 3 gives you a more pessimistic scenario. So you might call it more optimistic case, more pessimistic case, as far as how much visa demand is going to result from these number of people who have filed. And then the 2 bars on the right, just remembering that the first year when people reach the visa stage, it's going to be a carryover year with extra visas. That's illustrated in the yellow bar. And then once there's enough visa demand to absorb all the regular visas plus the carryovers, years after that are just going to be normal years. And so looking at the different sizes of these bars just shows me that as of April 30th, pipeline demand for rural visas was way below the number of annual visas, both in the initial carryover year and even just in a regular year. The carryover visas available in a carryover year almost 5 times higher than the that blue bar right there. The red bar almost 3 times higher than the blue bar. So that shows that there's still room for more rural visa applicants after April 30th. And of course, this is what happened in the 8 months leading up to April 30th. We don't know what's happened in the 8 months since April 30th.
But based on this, sorry, at least for rural, I mean, and I guess also because we're not getting really cases finalized for action. I mean, Charlie, for through the end of year of fiscal year 2024, years, like when you look at this data, you're still expecting the reserve visas to be current, right?
Yes, I think that it's clear that all the reserved categories will remain current throughout fiscal 2024.
And I did not even put fiscal 2024 on this slide because I just assumed this demand's not getting to visa stage by then. But fiscal 25, it has over 5,000 visas available. So that would be this year definitely way more than is needed for this number.
All the more reason we need to advocate for the visa numbers actually being used, for consulates to actually do their job, and for California Service Center to actually hurry up and process those adjustments. But
also, even on rural, it's a reason to advocate for more visa numbers, because as much of a difference as there is between the first 8 months of demand and annual supply, it's not an enormous difference. And so if 3 years from now, you still want to be able to be selling rural visas, you need to get more supply. But yeah, here's the comparison in high unemployment with estimated pipeline demand up to April 30th compared with annual supply.
This is not the same as rural. And here it looks like there is sufficient demand already for high unemployment to be able to meet a carryover year's worth of supply.
As I said, I would expect that the high unemployment category to remain current this year. I think at some point during fiscal 2025, it is likely that a final action date would need to be imposed based on this data that we have.
Yeah, and again, what I've illustrated in the yellow bar is the approximate availability in 2025. If only all these people could get to the visa stage in 2024, the number of visas available is higher. But I just don't think that's possible considering the rate of adjudication.
Yeah, and I think that if and when a date were to be imposed in 2025, I think in worst case scenario, it would be somewhere in mid 2023 date, which is, if you look at some of the other employment categories, the wait time would be relatively manageable.
Right. And I think even what this indicates is that if you filed your I-526E for high unemployment on April 30th, you're not necessarily looking at a whole lot of a wait time just because it's really close. What this is showing is that people who filed after April 40th might want to be thinking about their demand situation, because number one, the blue bar is going to be even higher for after April. And then also people who get to the visa stage after this initial carryover year visas get absorbed are going to be looking at that red bar as far as their visa availability.
And Charlie, just to clarify, when you're saying a final action date is being imposed, you're meaning that there's a backlog at that point?
Yes. The final action date is only imposed when the amount of demand and number use exceeds what the annual limit would be. So again, as Sean mentioned earlier, this is why it is extremely important that as many cases be processed to conclusion as possible this fiscal year, because then that just lessens the demand for numbers next year.
And that way it's also important for CIS to actually give us the data of the number of petitions in front so people can also make that educated guess.
Yes,
Because-
and it would, if you could, and also if they would be willing to provide the information on denial rates, because that would be extremely important. If you have the amount of petitions which have been filed, if you had a reasonable estimate of denials, then that would help you in doing projections of visa availability in the future.
Absolutely. And this is one thing I wanted to mention too, is that in here, we're putting in an assumption about visa demand based on pretty optimistic assumptions about the number of I-526 that are getting approved. But that might not actually be a good assumption for these first people coming in, because there is a lot in flux at the end of 22, beginning of 23, as far as regional centers are getting recertified. They're providing a whole bunch of documents for the first time. And let's say there were 3 big projects that went out and raised a whole bunch of investors. If those 3 I-956F got denied, that would wipe out every single I-526E associated with those 3 projects. And all of a sudden, this bar here of assumed visa demand, could be half the size. And so that would totally change the calculation. And so denial rates are very important to keep in mind. And we just don't know that because there's no track record yet.
Right. And also, despite the high levels of petitions, it is key. The petitions can be high, but the main factor is how many of those have been approved and are resulting in number use during fiscal 2025. So the potential demand could exceed the 2025 annual limit. But if those cases are not resulting in number use, then there would still be no need to impose a final action date, or not at least do so until late in the fiscal year.
So this is a really important point, because we've said this time and again on our blogs. The visa bulletin is not an accurate estimate of what the wait time could be. And in fact, Charlie, maybe we can talk a little bit about what happened in 2015 when, the market suddenly changed for China all of a sudden, because investors at that time suddenly now realized how long the wait time would be. For investors who are investing today, this information is critical, because you could invest into a project right now, let's just say a high unemployment project right now, thinking that you'll get your green card at a certain time. And suddenly, because of an unknown backlog, an invisible backlog that you're not aware of, it may take you significantly longer. Now, this may not necessarily impact your investment timeline right now, but there's discussion about changing up the sustainment period rules and making them back to what they used to be. And suddenly now you might find that your investments being redeployed or reinvested over and over again with different projects. Now, let's hope, such an investor-friendly provision does not actually get reversed. But in the meantime, I think it's important investors to worry about this issue. You could make the argument and say, well, the visa bulletin is going to be current for a while, so people can just file for adjustment of status. That may be true for the few people who are living in the US on their non-immigrant visas, but for many people who are outside the country, it could potentially take 3 or 4 years for your I-526 to be approved, because that is what it says right now on the CIS website. If it takes that long, you could be looking at a significantly long time to actually move into the country. It may also impact the way your petitions are approved, because USCIS does look at the visa bulletin before choosing which case to pick up and adjudicate. And alongside that, just having the unknown factor of not knowing that you're going to get your green card or not knowing if your petition will be approved or not, is a big risk for immigrant investors who are putting so much on the line. So this data, this information is important because you should make a decision. You as a prospective investor, hopefully, should be making a decision that is right for you, so you are getting your visa in a timely fashion. And I will say this, most conservative immigration lawyers, and Halston and Joey, feel free to weigh in on this with me, but most conservative immigration attorneys don't actually recommend that folks who do adjustment actually just get off their existing visa and hop onto the EAD advanced parole and live on that. You never know how things could turn out, right?
That's correct.
So,
you keep your flexibility when you maintain your non-immigrant visa status. So in the event something were to happen with the EB-5 petition, whether from a project or source of funds, or something happens with your adjustment, you're still able to remain here because you're maintaining that non-immigrant visa status. There's also travel issues involved if you were to go off of your H-1B. You know, in terms of like action items, so to speak, it's key that you guys keep the pressure on with the FOIAs so that we keep getting the data, but it's also key that we continue to pressure USCIS to transfer cases to NVC, and that we keep pressure on NVC and the consulates to schedule and to finalize visa number use before the end of this fiscal year in September. That's what's going to keep pushing this program moving forward and making sure that there's, decreasing the possibility for long backlogs.
Yeah. And as far as the actions that can be taken to prevent visa availability from, I guess, really controlling the program, one is if we can push to get more visa availability. The other thing is to try to make wait times as tolerable as possible.
people who invested back in 2019, mid to late 2019, are now, having their petitions approved and now waiting for their priority dates to move forward so they can actually get their conditional green card. So just for those people who are investing today, just keep that in mind, that people who invested, who went through the same exact program in 2018, 2019, took years to receive their green cards. Now, we can all talk about how great the new program is and all of that, but just remember, that's what those people just like you are going through because of, the agency and how slow processing and everything else that's happening.
And you make an excellent point there. It is imperative that the Immigration Service has timely processing of these petitions, because that is illustrated by the China unreserved date being back in 2015. That is a direct reflection of that petitions were not being processed for Chinese applicants in a timely manner when there were large amounts of numbers available to those Chinese applicants. And by the time their petitions did finally get approved, there were not sufficient numbers. So again, it is extremely important for the IPO office to be processing petitions in an expeditious manner.
And to their credit, and to my surprise, they actually seem to be doing better than expected, right? I mean, we're hearing about some I-526Es for rural projects being approved in, 3-4 months. You're hearing about high unemployment approvals. You've seen a couple of them come in 12, 13, 14 months. This is significantly faster than, some of our clients from 2019 who filed in November are still waiting for decisions, right? So, that new data is impacting the market. And that also influences, the choice of the investment. But, really the I-526 approval, it's important, but we need to get it further down the line so that the visa number can be used. That is the big, I think, inertia that we're seeing here that we're trying to overcome.
So I guess looking at this current chart that we have right now, so right here, we're sort of seeing the cumulative demand over time. The lines in orange and gray are assumptions based upon multiplying the number of petitions with the number 2 or 3. What you see here on the right, that is the estimated supply. I think the point of this particular slide that we're trying to highlight for those who are investing in the high unemployment category is that the demand is on the rise. There is one category that's facing a higher demand with a lower supply at this point of time, where we can tell from until April. What happens after that? Sure, we don't know, but
we don't want to be providing our predictions about wait times and things like that, because to be frank, it's a little bit irresponsible with the limited data that we have. And there are so many unknowns, both from the demand side and the supply side, that impact that analysis, that it's just not something that we feel comfortable doing. Now, if you take the data that you get from AIIA and you play around with it and you can make assumptions any which way you want, then you can draw your own conclusions. But that's just not something that really we were going to be doing here. What I thought this chart was really important to show is obviously the supply and the demand. And I just kind of want to reiterate and maybe ask you again, Charlie, what you had mentioned before about high unemployment, because I think it was so important. When you look at this data, when would you expect a final action date for high unemployment to be imposed? And if you could, what would you anticipate that date to be?
I would expect a high unemployment date at some point in the latter half of fiscal 2025. And a worst case would be a mid 2023 priority date or final action date. But again, there is so much unknown at this point. Although we do have this amount of demand, is that going to result in approvals? And are those approvals going to result in number use in 2025 to the level which would require a date? So it is very hard to speculate at this point on when dates may need to be imposed. I think it would, by sometime next year, middle of 2024, maybe we'd be getting some type of idea on number use. The State Department publishes on a monthly basis number use. Maybe there'll be some indication on there. Maybe USCIS might be releasing some adjustment data, which would allow to make better projections.
Charlie, sort of the same question, but for rural, what would you anticipate, or would you anticipate a final action date being imposed for rural? And if so, what date or time frame do you think that would be? I know there's a lot of caveats, but just in general.
Again, the rural date potentially sometime in 2025. Though I would say more likely in the latter part of the year, maybe the summer months, and a mid 2023 date. And if I could correct myself on the high unemployment, I think that the date would be an early 2023 final action date for high unemployment and a mid to late 2023 date for rural when it is imposed.
So based on the increased demand in high unemployment, the decreased supply of high unemployment, you would expect there to be a final action date earlier for high unemployment than there is for rural, based on this data that we have through April of 2023.
Definitely, I would say, and again, I would expect the processing to be cases to be finalized during 2025. There should be sufficient time for that to be allowed.
And what about for people who are not as worried about final action? They're focused on Chart B and being able to file I-485, so at least they could get advanced parole EAD. Do you have a comment on when Chart B?
In recent years, the Immigration Service seems to have allowed Chart B to be used for filing until the January to March range. And the earliest they ever cut it off was December. So again, that is one thing people can start monitoring Chart B. They may get some indication in terms of the availability of numbers. Because Chart B, in theory, is where the State Department believes the final action date for the applicable category will be in 8 to 12 months.
So you do think it's fair to say that in high unemployment, it's pretty likely that Chart B will stay available even for high unemployment throughout next year.
I think so. In throughout 2024, they may decide to impose an application filing date in Chart B for fiscal 2025, because they would not want to, the Immigration Service would probably not want to accept cases which they do not believe could be finalized within during an 8 to 12 month period in the future.
So I realize there's a lot of like sort of talk about the visa bulletin and kind of harping on that. But theoretically speaking, Charlie, we could also run into a scenario where everything stays current because petitions take forever to be approved. And then maybe it takes a year or more for adjustments or consul processing to happen. We hypothetically could also have a scenario where everyone who's been approved and pending right now doesn't even actually get their green card until the next fiscal year, or maybe after October of next year, right? In that case, we're just pushing things along. So even by the time the program is actually close to expiring and requiring renewal and things like that, everything could just stay current. And yet...
Yeah, you're perfectly right. The visa bulletin, the Chart A indicates visa availability for the coming month. It does not reflect what would be a year and a half down the road when my case is ready for final action. So again, yeah, you're absolutely correct. The processing rate, approval rate of petitions, when cases can be final action, the ball could get kicked down the down to 2020, late 2025, early 2026. So it is entirely possible that things could remain current for an extended period of time. Yeah. We do not have enough data at this point to make accurate predictions.
Or come 2024, hypothetically, we have an election that goes in the favor of immigrants, and we have a president who, urges USCIS to be more efficient. In that case, we could see petitions being approved faster, adjustments happening quicker, consulates across the world actually doing things much quicker too. And then we could see priority dates come about much quicker, right? Is it a scenario you see that perhaps for all countries, there being a priority date for high unemployment or rural?
I think at some point in the future, there is likely to be a single final action date for all countries, given the fact that so many applicants, as I said, everybody got out of the starting gates basically at the same time in this program as opposed to the earlier one. So the likelihood of a single date is greatly increased. But again, that would be far down the road when processing is at a normal, a regular pace, where large amounts of numbers are being used on a monthly basis.
Right, so this should segue nicely into really comparing now the numbers, and apologies for people who prefer bars and charts. Here we actually are comparing the demand of rural versus the supply of rural visas.
The leftmost column is the only fact here, that this is what we know, the number of I-526, I-526E that were filed. In the first demand column, this is the one that I look at the ×2, because I feel like this is a fairly plausible middle of the road scenario. And what I do is look at the number in this column and then compare it against the visa supply. And I'm looking at how many visas available are there for each potential applicant that I'm estimating. And so this is showing me that in a carryover year, there would be 5 visas available for every 1 visa demand that had accumulated in my estimate as of April. So that's a nice little cushion there. And even in a normal year with about 2,000 visas available, and these are just rounded numbers here, they could still handily accommodate the number of rural applicants that had come in the first 8 months of heavy demand. And then going down to China and India, China, the estimated amount of demand that had accumulated in rural, you can see it's higher than the 7% country cap. However, what I would look down then is the rest of the world demand. If only 146 rest of the world demand has come in for over 3,000 rest of the world visas available, that tells me that most of those 3,000 visas are going to be available to China and India. So this is showing that at least as of April 30th, 2023, that was a nice cushion available. And then again, these are the totals that accumulated in about 8 months leading up to April 30th. You could approximately double this if you wanted to guess that the 8 months since then were consistent with that same trend. Or if you feel like observing the market, actually there's been less rural demand in the past 8 months than before, then you'd make your estimate accordingly.
I think this is a really helpful chart, and you're obviously the queen at these charts and Excels, but I think it also gives people the ability to tinker around with it on their own as well, with their own assumptions. So I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely, and that ×2, ×3 are big assumptions that you could tinker with. And again, like if it turned out that this was demand incoming from like 3 rural projects and 2 of the projects ended up getting their I-926Fs denied, that would like wipe out a major number of these filings. So there really is a pretty big scope for what's possible.
So now let's look at...
Yeah, and the next is the same chart, but with high unemployment.
So with that, we can kind of talk about just some projections, which we can sort of make based on this. So you may have heard me harping on about, how bad high unemployment is. So I don't want investors to take that as a sign that they should all invest in a rural project. Because just because the data up until April shows things a certain way, it just may mean that, facts remain true right now. If after today, suddenly everyone decides to invest only in rural projects, you're going to see a seesaw effect where too many people then investing and taking up the rural set-asides. In an ideal world, there's equivalent demand across the projects. There's people investing in projects where they really feel that their money will be safe and they will receive really the end result that they want, which is the green card. But the biggest issue I think that we're trying to solve or we're trying to highlight here is having investors anticipate possible delays in receiving their immigration benefits. We can also sort of make the conclusion that high unemployment category needs more visas. China and India definitely are at higher risk, but there could also be a backlog for the rest of the world too. Charlie, I know we've already sort of talked about this a minute ago, but could you talk a little bit more about that and what scenario there could be a priority date for the whole world for a specific set-aside category?
Yes. Again, what they would do is look at the the amount of demand and an expected number used during the remaining months of the year, and how many numbers have already been used. And if the demand and number use already is expected to exceed the annual limit, only then would they impose a final action date. But again, as long as there are numbers available under the annual limit, they would leave everything current.
If the visa demand equals I-526 ×2, the rest of the world number there, we're estimating there's about 1,000 rest of the world demand. If those people happen to get to those visa stage in a normal year, when there are just about 860 visas available to the rest of the year, rest of the world, that's when you get a rest of the world date in the visa bulletin, right, Charlie?
Yeah, you would establish a final action date to be the 801st applicant, and so those 200 applicants, they would have to be waiting until the next fiscal year potentially to be processed.
Yeah, so the message to everyone out there raising funds, I think, is if you want to get this many rest of the world applicants regularly and in high unemployment, you want to get more than about 860 visas available to them per year.
And speed up adjudications so that these visas are actually issued.
Yeah, and another thing, when applicants are once the petition is approved, it's extremely important for applicants to act and supply any requested documentation so that their case can be finalized in an expeditious manner. When I was chief, we would often see applicants who would delay their interview at overseas post to coincide with the summer months. It was easier, etc. Sometimes, so they would delay and then sometimes get caught up and a visa number may not be available when it's convenient for them to process. So again, it's extremely important for people to act in a very timely manner to finalize their case.
Can we talk a little bit just about the impact of that exact what we just discussed on Chart A, Chart B, and how that could impact concurrent filing and kids aging out?
Well, the Chart A will be Chart A will be imposed for trying to use the maximum amount of numbers, and as well as Chart B. Chart B is where the final action date is likely to be, again, in 8 to 12 months. And they use the Chart B to generate enough demand so that the annual limits can be reached. So they will look and say, we need to use 1,000 numbers. We have demand for 600 applicants now. We will set a application filing date to generate another 400 applicants. So by the end of the fiscal year, we can have used all 1,000 visa numbers.
So let me kind of like give some real world implications of what would happen if Chart A, Chart B, if there's a priority date for your country. If, for example, you file your I-526E in say January of 2026, and maybe you're outside the US at the time, maybe 2 months later, you're planning to get an L1A and come inside the country and do concurrent filing. Once you have your non-immigrant visa and are living here in the US, perhaps at that point of time, if there's a priority date, you may not be able to use that concurrent filing benefit. If, for example, you invest today and there's a priority date on your country in the future and your petition has been approved, maybe you have a child who's older, who's above the age of 18, 19, 20, and perhaps the time between the approval of the petition and the time when you actually receive the conditional green card is quite long. You may risk you may risk having your child age out. So those are all issues to consider as you go about making your decision.
Yeah, and another important thing to keep in mind is that visa availability is not the only timing factor. So just as the visa bulletin doesn't tell us what visa availability is today, what pipeline demand is today, what pipeline demand is today doesn't tell us when the visa bulletin is going to move. So even though we look at these numbers and we think pipeline demand might be already excessive for high unemployment, that's no guarantee of when the visa bulletin is going to move. So we might be able to, all that's going to determine that is how quickly USCIS and Department of State move with their processing. And it's fairly safe to count on them being fairly slow, which means that we can expect the visa bulletin is not going to be moving very soon, even with the pipeline situation. And that can be a benefit for investors.
Yes, because these EB5 cases are much more complicated to be processed than other visa categories. And you have certain posts such as Guangzhou that would predominantly do the Chinese visas, and they may have staffing issues which would limit, even though there may be eligible applicants within the final action date, their processing capacity may limit how many can actually be scheduled in a given month.
I will say, though, that if you're stuck in that EB2, EB3 backlog, and EB5 is the pathway forward to you getting a green card, the time to file is now. You want to file as soon as possible. If you're in the United States and you're eligible to do concurrent filing and file the adjustment of status, in the future, once your I-526E is approved, and maybe there is a final action date at that point, you're still able to remain in the United States. You're still able to use your EAD and advance parole, and if necessary, file for extensions on those. And you're able to freeze the child's age based on USCIS's interpretation based on Chart B filing. So there are a lot of benefits of getting in early, not only your spot in the line, but also your protection for your children. That's less of an issue, or excuse me, that's more of an issue, I think, the child age out for those who are outside of the United States and are waiting for the consulate to issue the visa, in particular because the Department of State and USCIS disagree on the age out when a visa is available for purposes of seeking to acquire. All right.
Yeah, and Joey, as you mentioned, applicants in the India second and third preference category, those that are eligible to receive final action on their case during November, have been waiting 7 or 8 years for their turn to come up, and that is not likely to change in the future. Whereas, and so any EB5 reserved category date is likely to be significant, even when they are imposed, will be significantly less than the India second and third dates. And you can always benefit. You have two chances at a visa number becoming available each month.
Right, they are mutually exclusive. There's no problem being in the EB2 and EB3 and EB5 visa lines. You're just different tickets to get onto the plane.
So
and I think another important part of the calculation is what is the pain of the wait time, which I guess is what we've been talking about. But that calculation has changed since the Integrity Act, with I think the most important change being decoupling this investment sustainment period from the immigration timeline. The fact of a long immigration time was is very painful for pre-RIA investors, primarily because they have to keep their investment invested and deployed throughout that time, however long it is. And RIA changed that requirement, which could potentially make even long wait times more palatable than they had been before. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. And I'm also going to kind of push back a little bit on what Charlie and Joey said. You know, having done EB5 myself, I know that it's a lot of money at stake. And while it is easy to say you've got two horses in the race, you've got an EB2 and EB5, you know, EB5 is a huge investment for a lot of people and their families. So, you know, I would caution those with an EB2, EB3 date, you know, make sure it's really worth it for you. If you have an early enough date, and I don't know what that is, maybe Charlie over here could tell you, maybe it's not worth it for you to do EB5. Maybe if you have an early enough date and there's a chance that you could get your EAD advanced parole in the next 7-8 years, maybe go through a couple of H-1B renewals. I mean, you know, is EB5 truly worth it? You're going to have $800,000 tucked away in an investment making less than 1% a year. In most cases, it's something to worry about. And, you know, while these current rules with the sustainment period are pro-investor and definitely are helpful towards folks who may face longer immigration processes, there's no guarantee that that may also stick around. We, of course, you know, have our views on this, but that said, let's talk a little bit about going forward, what this means for EB5 investors and the EB5 community at large. The first and most important point I want to make is that it's really important that we get this data from USCIS. It does cost us time and money to get this information, so I would hope that the folks on this call, I encourage you to donate to us. Me and the other investors who are involved in this effort, we don't take a single dollar out of it for ourselves. We have 2 members on staff, 2 incredible folks who work on AIIA and really put forward the work that we do. And a lot of this presentation that you're seeing here today is by their effort. The second most important thing I want to say is that to investors who are on this call, there are invisible backlogs that are currently present in the set-aside categories. The truth is we don't really know how long they are and where they are, but this effort that we make, this is why it's so important. It impacts how long it will take for you to get your conditional green card. It could potentially impact other things as well. Certainty of knowing that, you know, I've done the EB5 investment correctly, for example. So we'd love to, you know, obviously have USCIS also clarify exactly how they're doing their processing, in what order, and if the visa availability approach still applies, and really what the approval rate is going to be. There may be a case where this backlog, that's invisible backlog, may not even be there because many people may drop out. Many people may choose to do partial investments and then suddenly find that they can't finance the rest of their investment. A lot of possibilities would come into play. We also aren't totally clear as to how priority processing is defined. If someone who invests in a rural category is indeed having their petition adjudicated first, maybe years ahead of someone who's investing in a high unemployment category.
Yeah, just to support what Sean's saying and AIIA's initiative, the data is so important. And like he said, it takes a lot of time and hours and a lot of staff. And, but because we understand the importance of it, that's why we're going to continue. When I say we, the Galati Law Firm is going to continue to work with AIIA on a pro bono basis to continue filing these FOIAs and the inevitable subsequent lawsuits that come. Because until USCIS starts unilaterally providing this data, we need it. And we need it to be able to allow you as EB5 investors to make informed decisions. And so it would be awesome for USCIS to start providing this unilaterally. I know Alyssa Emil, like Suzanne said, had her excuses for why she's not providing it, but we know they provide it to the Department of State on a monthly basis. So I'm not sure why that's different. But hopefully we can all continue to work together and advocate for this data to continue to help everybody involved to make these informed decisions.
Sean, I think what AIA is doing is excellent, and I thank you and thank Halston for fighting that good fight and getting us this data. It's incredible, and it's unfortunate it takes a litigation to do so, but I'm really glad that you guys are doing what is necessary to give us all this data. It's really important.
Yeah. And this really is for the integrity of the program, because for none of us does this help our day jobs. This is not helping anything that we're selling. This is just because in order to have an immigrant investor program where there's actually an immigrant in it, actually an immigration opportunity, we have to have a handle on the potential visa situation.
Without your organization having done the FOIAs, Suzanne compiling the data and slicing and dicing, this webinar would not have been possible. And by you presenting it and doing this, you're allowing people to make better informed decisions affecting their future. And that's the key thing for what your organization is doing is extremely important for the average applicant.
And another thing I want to say is that, so big picture, what we have gathered is that up until April, there was fairly high demand for high unemployment, not as high demand for rural, which makes the balance of supply and demand look tight on high unemployment and good for rural. And as far as sort of projecting that to what's the situation right now, is there a circumstance under which high unemployment could actually still be a good option right now, and a circumstance under which rural could not be a good option? I would say on the high unemployment side, if there is much higher denial rates than we used in our little assumptions, then it could be that actually high unemployment is still okay. Also, we're not putting a specific number of years on it, so it would be up to the individual investor to think, well, how long a visa wait could I personally tolerate? And then on the rural side, there would have had to be about 4 to 5 times as many filings as had happened up to April, between April and now, in order for there to be a crunch in rural.
To learn more about the EB5 program, the EB5 investment process, or what AIIA is doing in the political sphere, please visit our website at goaiia.org. Check out our blog, check out our resources. We have tons of resources for both prospective and current investors. We also post very regularly about what we're doing in the political sphere to fight for investors' rights. So with that, we'll see you later.